Thank you very much, David, and also thank you very much for setting this all up. This was, again, this was not sponsored by anybody. David said he would like to hear me. I said, if you can put together a group, you can do it.
If anyone would like to leave a donation at the end, it'd be very...
Okay, yes,
very,
donations would be much appreciated.
To keep the blog going.
That's right, suggested donation of 20 shekels. But again, thank you very much to David. He put this together, and he did a lot of work in order to do this, so I very much appreciate that. Again, I am Elder of Ziyon. I've been blogging since, or essentially I had my own webpage since 2004. Blogging is sort of passé now to call it that, but still. Been doing original analysis, some historical research, doing a lot of things about legal arguments, international law. I am not a lawyer, but lawyers have come to me and said, "You're pretty good at this stuff." I'm like, I don't know, Gemara, I'm not sure. Lots of sarcasm. I do a lot of Arabic article translation. I do not know Arabic. I use Google Translate. However, when there's something I don't understand, there are experts that I can send to, or I can ask the question of to make sure. And generally, it's been reasonably accurate. Cartoons, I make original cartoons, videos, posters, infographics. I've had scoops that have been picked up by worldwide media. Media criticism of my own, is the media bias and that sort of thing, and lots of other things. So it's mashing together of what NGO Monitor and Camera and Honest Reporting and the Israeli government to some extent, and what a lot of other people put together. Almost 25,000 posts over the nearly 12 years. 20,000 Twitter followers. I've been quoted here and there. A couple of weeks ago. Let's try to keep these contemporary. A couple of weeks ago, PA President Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, was speaking during a speech to the EU, and he added a little sentence, which we all heard about by now, that was not originally meant to be in his speech. And he said, only a week before that, so let's say 3 weeks ago, a number of rabbis in Israel made a clear announcement demanding that their government poison the water to kill the Palestinians. This is what he said in front of the EU. He got a great round of applause. Nobody from the EU felt that this was a problem that he said this. Nobody felt that this was, he was like, he got 30-second standing ovation. I put it on Twitter. There was absolutely no problem whatsoever with what he said. And I heard the translation, at least in English, I heard the audio of it. It was very clear what he was saying. He went to a ages-old anti-Semitic stereotype that Jews poisoned the wells, and nobody cared. As a matter of fact, he went beyond. In other words, I traced this history of the story. What the history was, about a week before that, in a Hebrew website, they showed a video of somebody from Breaking the Silence from a couple years earlier, showing, talking to his crowd, and he said, yeah, the settlers sometimes poison the wells. The PLO itself put out a thing, put out on their own website, on one of their official websites, said that a rabbi said, and they named the rabbi, a rabbi who doesn't really exist, but with a similar name to someone who does exist, and this never happened. But he said, a rabbi, the head of the settlers, instructed the settlers to be able to poison. So that's how it changed it to the first iteration of the story. That got picked up by a few other places. By the time it got picked up by a few other places, it was already debunked, widely, I should say. But then Abbas didn't only just repeat the story, he embellished it. He added his own twist to it, because at the time he said this, none of the Arab media reported that it was a number of rabbis. None of them reported that they made a clear announcement. Nobody said that they demanded that their government do it. So he even added to the incitement a great deal to what was already said. And this is his own self. And again, nobody really had a problem. In the end, State Department says, yeah, this is problematic, blah, 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 and then they just let it go. And then he made his... and then of course he saw that reporters started asking him questions and saying, okay, do you really believe this? And he said, oh, okay, it turns out it's baseless. I don't want to take that away from everything else I was saying about how terrible Israel is. So yeah, I'll walk it back. So it's important to understand that part of it is that he only retracted after the Israeli government made a big stink over this. And then the reporters started asking about this. He said outrageous things in the past before. He's done many outrageous things. He's claimed that that settlers are raising wild dogs in order to attack the Palestinians, and that they also have wild boars, pigs that they raise. Yeah, the Jews, the religious settlers, are raising pigs, which are untrainable wild boars, and training them in order to attack only the Palestinian fields. I mean, this is the stuff he said. He said this stuff in speeches, and the reporters never asked him about any of this. It happens to be this time the Israeli government made a big deal over it, and then the reporters asked him about it, and he had to walk it back, which is very important to think about afterwards, because it's going to be a theme that we're going to be talking about today. But anti-Semitism is not just based on that. That was, you could say, okay, maybe in a weird sort of universe you could pretend that what Abbas had said was not really anti-Semitic, that was some sort of anti-Zionist. But, as mentioned, I do monitor the Arab media. It's actually very simple. Anybody can do this. I Google every day in Google News. I Google the Arabic word for Jews, and I see what comes up. Every day something interesting comes up. So, Al Aram, really the largest newspaper in Egypt, had a 5-part series in May and June this year. This is all contemporary. I'm talking about literally what's happening right now. A 5-part series all about how Jews, following the Talmud, they didn't even have to come to the elders of Zion. They say it's all Talmudic. How they're trying to take over the world. They're aiming to destroy all the ethics, all the other religions. 5-part series about this. Not one comment that anybody, any Arab in any of the Arab world that was commenting on this saying, I'm not so sure if this is true. You're saying nothing. This is completely accepted. Ziyon, also a very respected independent newspaper in Egypt. Their English version is called literally Egypt Independent, and they regarded, they'll have culture articles, they'll have arts articles. These are not Islamist magazines by any stretch of the imagination. It had an op-ed in June, first denying and then justifying the Holocaust, saying, it really didn't happen. It was only maybe a few Jews that died, but what the Jews did? They destroyed the economy. They introduced homosexuality to Germany. They said all of this stuff. And they ruined Germany's economy and world. And this is literally all happening today in major newspapers, and that's just Egypt. Just going to the other side of Israel, in Jordan, there's just a few things I picked up that I've mentioned on my blog, and this happens often. Asabil, a Jordanian paper, said, in 2010, Jews exercised mind control over people and fabricated the Holocaust. In 2012, the same newspaper said, the venomous Jewish snake can only be dealt with by cutting off her head. It sounds like incitement to me. Amon News. Also, it's a fairly right-wing newspaper. Jews were behind the Boston bombing, and they also fabricated the Holocaust. Oh, okay, sure. And the store, yet another, Constitution in English. They had a 3-part series in 2013 on Jewish traits. One of them included that Jewish trait is to kill Goyim, of course. So this is, this is just a tip of the iceberg of what's going on. I'm not going to go through all the examples because it would take far more than the time we have today. But we're going to go through a little bit of the history and try to find some underlying themes and try to understand exactly how Arab anti-Semitism hit the point that it's at today. But I do want to make a cautionary note. While it certainly has existed, and we'll be talking about it for a while, it's never, Arab anti-Semitism and Muslim anti-Semitism has never approached the level of anti-Semitism of the Christian world and Nazi Germany or anything like that. Not even close. So when the Arabs come and they say, well, the Jews lived, with us beautifully for these thousands of years, it wasn't beautiful. It wasn't great, but it was not a comparison. It was there was no Islamic equivalent to what the Crusades did to the Jews or to the Spanish Inquisition or the many massacres and pogroms. There are a couple, there's the Farhud, there are a couple things here and there, but not close to what really happened. But that's just keep that in mind, because it's not. Stuff I'm going to be saying is bad, but you have to always keep things in perspective. I'm going to posit today that there were 3 historical stages of Arab and Muslim anti-Semitism. One is before Islam itself was created and codified. Then there is roughly from 8th century, or 7th century, 8th century, when Muhammad is alive, until the era of modern Zionism, and then there's now. However, it's also almost a continuum. It's not, these are not quite discrete time periods. Arab anti-Semitism certainly existed even before, in pre-Islamic times. The Talmud, I just looked this up, it was fun, and in Bava Batra, says that Arabs who come to Kumbadita in Iraq and Babylonia and compel the Jews to give them the deed to their homes. It's just, something they mentioned they did. So there was some bullying here and there. So there was, and of course we had Ishmael and Ishmael and things like that. But of course we have to get to the Quran. The Quran is interesting because the Quran has parts that were written in Mecca and parts that were written in Medina. If I remember correctly, the first parts that were written in, I'm getting mixed up, I'm not sure which one it is. The earlier parts of it were generally not so terrible towards Jews. They were generally, they were repeating and changing some of the stuff that's said in Tanakh, but it wasn't terrible. The later parts of it, which most Muslims believe supersede the earlier parts, but the later parts were a bit more anti-Semitic by any definition. And it got worse than that. The hadiths that were created after the Quran tended to be more anti-Semitic. There's one that I hadn't heard about before I started researching this that said that Allah changed Jews to rats, which was an interesting one. And the other one is the famous one with the Garkad tree, saying that the ends of times are not going to happen until every tree and rock is going to say, hey, there's a Jew behind me, and come Muslim and come kill him, except of course for the Garkad tree, which is going to be the one that protects the Jews. And there's plenty of Muslim articles talking about how Jews like to plant Garkad trees, which I believe is a box tree. There's different people that say different things. It doesn't matter. The important thing that the Quran says for Jews and Christians is that mandates that the vanquished non-Muslims that live in their countries or under their ummah pay a tribute, a jizya tax, in exchange for protection. That's really like the only law essentially codified in the Quran as far as how to treat Jews, saying they pay the jizya tax and they will be protected as dhimmis, as the word is. But over time, other restrictions started being added to what dhimmis had to do. Even so, life was generally tolerable for Jews under Muslim rule, as I mentioned before. In 1772, a sheikh in Egypt, in Cairo, was asked a question from, as a shayla, saying, hey, well, how are we supposed to treat the Jews? Jews, I hear terrible things about them. I think that I even heard they might have tried to kill Muhammad, or they did kill Muhammad, something like that. Based on all of that, how are we supposed to treat the Jews? It's a very long thing, but it's all in English. You could actually find it out on I found it at a Fordham University site. So here's, I boiled it down to the major points that he says. Dhimmis, which is Jews and Christians. Dhimmis, under Muslim rule. Dhimmis cannot dress in nice clothing, because that might humiliate Muslims. Their dress must be different, but must be not as nice. Dhimmis are not allowed to ride horses or use saddles, cannot have Muslim servants. Muslims are not allowed to greet dhimmis. Dhimmis must walk to the side to allow Muslims to pass in case the road is narrow. Dhimmis are not allowed to build new houses of worship. They can only repair buildings that were around since before Islam, so at that time already more than 1,000 years old. And Jewish and Christian houses must be shorter than Muslim houses. And also, dhimmis must not display wine in public, because that's also a great insult. So if you look at these rules, there's something that's very interesting that's in common with them all, which is that there's a theme, and the theme is humiliation. But it's a double-sided humiliation. One is they want to humiliate the dhimmis. They want them to make sure you're second-class citizens, you are less than us, you are not as good as we are, you're always going to be number two. There's no way that you're ever going to be equals to us. But more importantly, the rules are also to avoid humiliation of Muslims. Because they're saying, hey, you can't have clothes nicer than us. That's not necessarily to humiliate the Jews as much as to say, because he says explicitly, he says, if the Jews or the Christians have nicer clothes, then Muslims might think, oh, maybe I want to be a Jew or a Christian. Because maybe they're better off than we are. So humiliation is like a key theme, but it's both sides of humiliation. It's the dhimmis, the Jews and Christians must be humiliated, but the Muslims must avoid humiliation at all costs. If you want to understand, and it is a recurring theme throughout my blog and throughout many other people's writings, Richard Landis, others. If you need to understand how the Muslim and Arab relationships work with everybody else in the world, you have to understand the honor-shame dynamic. I'm going to give a very, very brief overview of the honor-shame system. We live in what's called a guilt culture. There's this little matrix that I've grabbed from a website, but it's very good. Let's say that something, you did something. You did something wrong. Or you're perceived of doing something wrong. So there's a matrix. If you're in a guilt culture, and for both guilt and shame cultures, if you didn't do it, and everybody believes you didn't do it, then there's no problem. If you did do it, and everybody believes you did it, then you're going to be punished or whatever. However, the big differences are, if you didn't do it, and other people believe that you did do it, in a shame culture, in a guilt culture, so if they believe you did do it, then you protest your innocence and you fight the accusation. You say, I didn't do it, I'm innocent, I'm going to fight and improve my rights. And contrarily wise, if you did do it and nobody knows that you did something wrong, then generally you still feel guilty about it. It's like, okay, maybe you got away with it, maybe not, but there's still a guilt that's associated with it. Shame culture is the opposite. And the shame culture is, if you didn't do it and the people think that you did do it, then you're shamed. There's not that, you don't protest yourself. It's already, you game over. If people think that you are guilty of something, that you are, you had a moral failing of some sort, then it's as if you really did do it. The perception is what's important, not the truth. And this is critical, that it's the perception that the Arab and Muslim societies that hold by this honor-shame culture, the perception is what trumps reality. Similarly, if you did do something and nobody knows that you did it, then there's no problem at all. In Muslim culture, it's like, okay, then it's as if it didn't, as if it didn't happen. I got away with it, and there's absolutely no problem. But the shame, so in a shame culture, it means you avoid humiliation at all costs, which is the reason that honor killings exist. It's because if your daughter is accused of doing something that, that puts a stain on your family, you don't defend the daughter because you've already lost. You already have been shamed. The only way to get the honor back is to get rid of the source of shame. A very fundamental difference between how the Arab world in general, again, there's always exceptions, but how the Arab world in general thinks of things and how the Western world in general thinks of things. And again, I'm not going to give a moral, although I do believe that obviously that the guilt culture is morally superior, but I'm not going to say this, as an absolute. Japanese had a shame culture, as kamikaze pilots and stuff like that. That's all part of that sort of thing. So there's not necessarily a terrible thing, but it can be in the case of something like honor killings. But this is critical to understand. Yes.
Something you read somewhere, or it's your theory?
No, the guilt and shame culture is well known. That's been well studied. I did not make this up. This is well known. So, if we look at, again, the 19th century treatment of Jews and Arabs, we see that the rules that were done by the Sheikh were not only implemented, but they were exceeded by Muslims. Now, whether the rules still existed in the 15th century, 13th century, maybe or maybe not. I can't say I know the answers to this. But it seems to me that there's a continuum that it was getting worse and worse. So here's something, again, most of these examples come from a book called The History of the Hebrew Nation from 1841. I just happened to pick this at random. I do have a habit of going through Google books, looking through 18th and 19th century books, looking for the word, Jews, Middle East, Musselman, or whatever, Ishmaelites, whatever the word to be, see if anything interesting comes up. So this is a pretty good one. But he said that this one did an overview of all of the Muslim nations, or all the Middle Eastern nations, and said how they treat Jews was among one of the topics. And he said, the boys as a pastime would beat and torment the Jewish children, the men kick and buffet the adults, they walk in their houses at all hours, take the grossest freedoms with their wives and daughters, you can imagine, with the Jews invariably coming off with a sound beating if they venture to resist. And this is not the only time I've read this sort of thing about Morocco. In Syria, it was reading, in 1823, Damascus, all the Jews that were suspected of owning property were thrown into prison. So this is just a mass shakedown of Jews. And in Palestine, in Tzfat in 1834, it says that their houses were stripped, they extorted money, so that the lowest fella would stop them when traveling and demand money as a right, there were high taxes. The reason that Jews could not really do anything with agriculture, according to this book, in the early 19th century is because they were taxed at triple the rate that the Arabs were, and they just effectively just not made it possible for them to do it. And it said, the commonest soldier would just seize the most respectable Israelite Jew and compel him to sweep the streets and perform most degrading offices. And again, and the word Jew itself was used as a spiteful term. So again, humiliation is like the theme. It's like the underlying theme. You must humiliate the Jews. And I believe, and then my theory is, that I believe this was getting worse and worse over time. And the reason I believe this, we'll get into this. First of all, the question is this anti-Semitism? And of course it's anti-Semitism. Again, it's not Christian anti-Semitism, it's not pogroms, but this is pretty fundamental, it's anti-Semitism. But it's still different. Because Christian anti-Semitism is motivated by a pure hate of the Jew. The Jew is the devil himself, the Jew is evil himself, because the Jew has killed the Son of God. So the Jew has become, the true object of hate. This was not the case at the time, certainly as of the 19th century, is not the case in the Muslim world. It was more motivated by, in my opinion, by fear of being humiliated. The Islamic world was growing fairly steadily from the time of Muhammad up until the 16th century, until the siege of Vienna. And so the Muslims, and the Muslim world was also the leader in philosophy and in science, and they were on top of the world. And at roughly the end of the 16th century, it ended. It got stalled. And by the end of the 17th century, it started getting rolled back. So you can just imagine, from the Muslim perspective, they were unbeatable. For centuries they were unbeatable. They were continuously growing. History was set on their side. They were sure that over time, we're taking over the world. It's inevitable. That's because that we have the truth behind our side. That's it. And all of a sudden, there's a glitch. The glitch is Christian Europe rose up, got together. Finally, the Poles and the Holy Roman Empire got together and decided, okay, we have a serious threat over here. Let's fight against them together. And they pushed them back. Which means, from a Muslim perspective, they were humiliated. All of a sudden, their entire belief system was shaken. It was, hey, something's going on. We're not, things are not as inevitable. History is not as much on our side as it looked like before. All of a sudden, the Christian Europe is coming up. It's stronger than us. It's starting to get better than us technologically. It's starting to get better than us philosophically and scientifically. We're stalling, and they're going ahead. This had to have a huge effect on the psyche of Islam altogether. And they, in my opinion, I think part of the reason that the dhimmi rules were getting a little bit more and more, terrible for the Jews and for the Christians that were still under Muslim rule is because, as a reaction, we are being humiliated now as a people, so therefore we must now increase the humiliation we're giving to other people, the people that are under our rule. So we had to make sure that they're going to, not only do they have a second-class status, but they're going to continue and know that they're going to have a second-class status. This is my chiddush, so to speak, as I'm trying to put together today. So, until Zionism, the Jews played their part. We're second-class citizens. That's the way it is. In Europe also, it was like, okay, we don't have any political power. We don't have anybody that's on our side. The Jews that were in Arab lands did not have an appeal of any outside nation that would protect them. They didn't have much. But in the modern form of Jewish nationalism, when Zionism started coming up in the late 19th century, all of a sudden things started to change from the Arab perspective. Those dhimmi Jews were starting to organize themselves politically. They were getting positions of power. They were no longer acting humiliated. And the Arabs, again, not to stereotype it in general, Arab mentality has, and I've read this again, I'm not making this up, I've seen this in op-eds and things like that in Arab newspapers. It's very much a zero-sum game. In the West, and Jews will generally say, let's find a win-win. Look at the peace negotiations. This is a perfect example of this. We want a win-win. We want to come up with ways that both of us get what we want and maximize things as much as possible. But in the Arab mentality, if the other side wins, you lose, and vice versa. It's always a zero-sum game, which is really important to understand. Yes?
Just a clarification. You said the Jews were beginning to come up in the world.
Yes.
Obviously, at this time, the Jews were coming up in the world in Europe. Were the Jews in Arab lands, Muslim lands, also beginning?
This is what I'm talking about. I'm saying the beginning of Zionism. So I'm saying, my time period I'm thinking about when I'm saying that is like the 1920s.
So in both worlds, they were.
In both worlds, yeah. But I'm talking about specifically in the Muslim world.
Yeah.
Specifically in the Muslim world, I'm talking about over here. Specifically in Palestine.
Thank you.
Sure. So there's a zero-sum game. So the Arabs are saying, if the Jews are rising up and getting more organized, that means we're losing. Doesn't necessarily mean that, no, but this is a part of how they think. So let's just skip a little bit. This is a little bit parenthetical, but it ends up being critical. The Mufti of Jerusalem was virulently anti-Semitic. I'm not going to say that he was mainstream as far as his anti-Semitism is concerned. He was actually very, very much in the vanguard of Arab and Muslim anti-Semitism. They were not this anti-Semitic before the Mufti. As most of you, I assume, know, the Mufti of Jerusalem was appointed by the British. He then called himself the Grand Mufti, or Mufti, and he started immediately trying to give himself as much power as possible. And he centered the power around specifically the Temple Mount, saying that Jews were going to destroy the Al-Aqsa. He was the first one to come up with this claim, saying Jews were going to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque. He went all around the Arab world saying that, hey, I've got the third holiest site in Islam, which is not necessarily the case as was beforehand, but nevertheless, we could talk. We're not going to get into that right now. But he said, I got this thing. You got to give me money so I can keep it, defend it from the Jews, and we can give it a gold top because it didn't have a gold top at the time. The Dome of the Rock was, whatever. All of these things he was going to do. It's really the Dome of the Rock was in bad shape. You could look at it. If you look at the old pictures, and it was like holes in the roof and weeds all over the pavement, and it was just, it was not that wonderful looking. But he was raising money to refurbish the entire Haram al-Sharif, but he was beyond that, and of course he was involved in the riots, the anti-Jewish riots in the early 1920s. He was almost certainly involved in the 1929 riots, as well as the 36 to 39 Arab uprising. But what's most important from our perspective is he actually was, not only was he created an entirely new anti-Semitic philosophy for Muslims that continued to this day, that's being held by Islamists. Here's just a quote from him, that from, I think, 1937, a speech. The battle between Jews and Islam began when Muhammad fled from Mecca to Medina. Slander was their weapon. They said, well, Muhammad was a swindler. They tried to undermine his honor. Again, honor. Just as they were able to betray Muhammad, so they'll betray Muslims today. He was the first one to really put anti-Semitism within a Quranic context. Even though there were some verses here and there in the Quran that could be interpreted as against Jews, he was the first one to actually make it theological as a part of Islam. And he went to Germany. He was, supported the Nazis, and he started playing all of the, radio shows. The Nazi radio in Arabic would play his speeches, and this was very instrumental. These speeches were very important in changing Muslim Islamist thought, specifically the Muslim Brotherhood, was taking a lot of his speeches as essentially their new version, or they would say it's the same version, but essentially it was an innovation in Islam. So, before the Mufti, Arab and Islamic anti-Semitism were geared more towards the keeping the Jews in second-class status. But since he started doing all this, Arab and Islamic anti-Semitism started taking on elements of traditional Christian anti-Semitism as well as Nazi anti-Semitism. But more than that, it actually started incorporating it within, from the Islamist point of view, within the religion itself. And this continues to today. Let's do another slight detour. Let's talk about Nakba. As again, many of us probably know, the term was coined by a Syrian writer to describe how Arabs were not prepared to win the battle with the modern Western style state of Israel. It really has nothing to do with refugees when he first came up with the word Nakba. Interestingly, we hear about Nakba Day. Every year's Nakba Day, it's a big deal. Nobody called it Nakba Day until the late 1990s. They certainly marked the anniversary. May 15th was something, and they would say, okay, something bad happened, it was your anniversary. They didn't call it Nakba. And the reason was because, again, we have to get to honor and shame. The reason was because the PLO was trying to position itself, we're revolutionaries, we're going to win back our land with, honor and with fighting and with the sword. And by emphasizing refugees and victimhood, that's not the message we want to give. We want to give messages of revenge and military might and everything like that. During the Oslo process, they changed their tactics, really, is what it came down to. So the humiliation part they downplayed because they realized they can get a lot more from acting as victims at this point. But still, there was a role of humiliation in the initial use of the word Nakba, because that's when the Syrian writer that did it. And the way that the PLO refused to use the term was also fear of humiliation is, again, key. So, the term doesn't specifically refer to humiliation, but from an Arab nation perspective, forgetting the Palestinian Arabs for this point, but from the Arab nation perspective, there's no doubt that the 1948 war was a Nakba, meaning a catastrophe, because, again, they were humiliated, and humiliated in the worst way possible. They started off bragging, saying, we're going to win, we're going to drive the Jews into the sea, it's going to be easy, get out of the way so we can do it. They were confident, cocky that they were going to be able to do it. Not only did they not do it, not only did they lose the combined armies of all these Arab nations, but their failure was witnessed. The whole world was looking at this. This wasn't just an inter-Arab war that nobody really cared about. This was a war between Arabs, and the Jews were just, in the news, because Jews are always news. And their failure was seen by the entire world. This was unbelievably humiliating from the Arab perspective. I found an article just recently, Al Jazeera in 2009, talking about the 1948 war, and it continuously uses the word humiliating. That's what they think about it, is the word humiliation. Of course, 1967 redoubled the humiliation, and from Egypt's perspective, 1973 restored their honor. And in a way, that's the only reason we have peace right now, is because of this perception of Egypt that their honor was restored after the 1973 war. We would not have that peace because they lost the war. Right? It was terrible for Israel, but Egyptian Third Army was surrounded. There was in the end, it was pretty bad for Egypt by the time the ceasefire came about. But Egypt celebrates it every year. It's our victory. We win. Today's Arab and Muslim anti-Semitism. Now, what's interesting about it today is it includes everything. There is no element of historical anti-Semitism that is not now part of the Arab narrative of anti-Semitism. Literally everything is in there and more. They've innovated other new things. So, blood libels. We see it. We see it happen. They say, this is one of my scoops from a couple of years ago. An NGO called Mifta, which is headed by Hanan Ashrawi. In Arabic, they had an article just on their website saying, oh, by the way, the Jews do, kill Muslim kids for their matzahs, for the blood for their matzahs. And when I pointed out to them, they reacted furiously and they said, who are you? You can't say this sort of thing. Who are you? And finally, when the media picked up on it, then they said, okay, we'll take it off, on our website, and we didn't really mean to do it. And please don't associate this with Hanan Ashrawi. She doesn't believe that. And it ended up being quite a big deal. But they believe it. The blood libel, they believe it. They've changed it. Sometimes they'll still keep it as Christians. Sometimes they'll change it to Muslims. And they certainly still believe it. Water poisoning, and there's variants of the water poisoning, not just the wells. But they'll say things like, the Zionists are selling them. It's interesting. They do two things. They say either sex gum in order to make them crazy about sex, or they'll say impotence, things that can make them impotent. One or the other. Right? If the Jews were able to make either of those, they would be, really, really successful.
Both would be better.
Yeah, well, yeah. But they talk about the elders of Zion, Talmudic decrees, Freemason, conspiracy theories, which fits in well with Arab conspiracy theories because Arabs love conspiracy theories. The Jews as devils comes in. That was just a cartoon just this week. That was mentioned by a Palestinian Media Watch from an Egyptian cartoon from a couple years ago. They have Holocaust denial, of course. They have Holocaust inversion, saying that the Jews are the new Nazis. And they have the Holocaust justification, like I mentioned before, saying the Jews deserve it. So you see all three. And of course, there's the new variant that they like to take, which is that they didn't innovate, but they like to use it, is that, the Jews of today aren't really even Jews. They're the Khazar. So if you even say that the Quran talks about Jews and they say nice things, it's not talking about them. The Jews of today are just imposters. But there are some Arab and Muslim specific anti-Semitic themes that are also in vogue and quite inherent, quite widespread in the Arab world. The Jews are killers of prophets, and they'll be talking about things that happen in Tanakh as well as attempted killing of Muhammad. Some people say they even successfully, a poison that's, a Jewish woman poisoned Muhammad, and that would help to contribute to his martyrdom. That's what turned him into a martyr, not just dying a natural death. But there are people that say that. So that's the equivalent of the Christian deicide argument. The Jews are breakers of treaties, as they say that all the time. Jews distort the word of God, and they're guilty of blasphemy. They claim that Ezra, what they call Uzer, but we believe it's Ezra, falsified the Torah. So in other words, because they say, things like, Abraham's two sons, they say Ishmael was the one that was sacrificed, for example. So they say the Torah was wrong and falsified, and theirs was right. So they say that, Ezra is the one that falsified the Torah, and they say that he was considered by Jews to be the son of God, which is, of course, blasphemy from their perspective. They say Jews broke a covenant with God, which is a rough equivalent of replacement theology. We're going to speak about roughs for a little bit later. Apes and pigs. When they say, Jews are apes and pigs, we hear about that. They weren't talking about all Jews. They were talking about Jews who broke the Sabbath. And if you look in the Quran, what they're talking about. So they're saying, the Jews were the ones that broke the covenant, and therefore, the implication, they don't say this so directly, I haven't seen this so directly, but the implication is, therefore the Jews have no business anymore claiming any sort of covenant with God. Of course, Israeli Jewish plans to demolish the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which started with the Mufti, is a widespread theme daily. I mean, daily, every single day that Jews that any Jew comes and visits the Har HaBayit, it's a front page headline in the newspaper in the Arab world. Every day. Settlers today went in to do Talmudic, ceremonies. Every day you'll see this thing. They don't get sick of it. There's nothing new that happens, but they say, there's a bunch of, and they'll take the pictures of the settlers, and they're just walking around and doing nothing, and they say, look, they're trying to do this, every day. And of course, Israeli Jewish plans to expand from the Nile to the Euphrates. It's also a very recurrent theme. in Arab media. The most famous example they give is they claim that the Israeli flag, the two stripes on the Israeli flag, one represents the Nile, the other represents the Euphrates. And they believe this 100%. There's also, of course, the standard thing, drive the Jews into the sea. This is a cartoon from 1967. I have a whole series, actually, of very interesting pre-1967 war cartoons. But here's Nasser literally kicking a Jew into the sea. Stereotypical Jew with the hat and the payas and the beard. And this is a lot of the cartoons you see in the Arab. I didn't spend too much time on cartoons this time because, again, we could spend all day on that. But very often, Muslim cartoons and Arab cartoons about Israel will not just, the Israeli is represented by a stereotypical Haredi Jew. However, there's also specific Palestinian manifestations of anti-Semitism. In this slide, we're talking about the Christian Palestinians. Christian Palestinians came out with this document in 2009 called the Kairos document. It was based on an earlier document written in 1967. One is required of the Christian faith concerning the Palestine problem. And they say that essentially they pretty much are throwing out a lot of the Old Testament and even some of the New Testament and saying there's no covenant with Jews. The Jewish covenant is over. God did not promise anything to Jews. The church has taken over what the Jewish position was at the time. This is called, the replacement, liberation theology, supersessionism. But since they say that the Jewish race specifically is not meant to have any political power, not meant to be treated as an entity like that, the Jewish state itself is a sin. They have, even though no real Catholic or Christian leader signed on to this, the people that did do this have managed to get a lot of mileage out of it by pretending that the major, Palestinian Christians and Greek Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox, that they were really support it, because they wrote a statement saying, well, we really should be looking at this a little bit more closely. But they took that as a statement saying, oh, they support us, and they ran with it. And you'll see, there are elements of this that are now being promulgated in the U.S. and other places. And now also, and their replacement theology even will say, and this is Mahmoud Abbas says this, that Jesus was a Palestinian martyr. Jews killed Jesus, first Palestinian martyr. The very specific Palestinian political manifestation of anti-Semitism is the denial of Jews being a people altogether. And this, I'm reading this from a PLO memo that came out during the Palestine Papers time. It says, recognizing the reason we cannot recognize the Jewish state. They're very adamant why everybody says, hey, just recognize the Jewish state. In fact, I don't know if the story is true, but it was just tweeted by somebody who was in the know a few days ago saying the Arab countries were ready to accept Israel as a Jewish state already. Let's just get this whole stupid thing over with. And the Palestinians said, no, we're not going to. It's very interesting. But they say, recognizing the Jewish state implies recognition of a Jewish people, recognition of its right to self-determination. And we can't accept the Jewish people. So there was another really interesting essay written by a former PLO negotiator, and again, I apologize that I'm going to be reading most of this, but it's worth it, in which he said, if Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people, then the lands it occupies today belong to this people by way of right. If these lands rightfully comprise the Jewish homeland, then the Arab presence becomes historically aberrant and contingent. The Palestinians effectively become historic interlopers and trespassers, a transient presence on someone else's national soil. Clearly, this is not the Palestinian Arab narrative, nor can it be. Now again, think about it again in terms of how honor shame it works over here. Reality is not what's important. Perception is what's important. So whether the Jews were there or not is not the concern. The concern is we cannot ever accept the idea of a Jewish people because of the consequences to us. So historic truth is not the important thing. The important thing is the perception. We must make sure the perception is Jews are only a religion, like any other religion, but they're not a people. For us to adopt the Zionist narrative would mean that the homes that our forefathers built, land they took for centuries they built and prayed for, were not really ours at all. Our defense of them was morally flawed and wrongful. We had no right to any of these to begin with. This is what this guy, this former PLO negotiator wrote this stuff in an article, in a scholarly article. So again, they're saying this is the reason we can't accept it. Truth is irrelevant. Truth has nothing to do with anything. It's because we cannot accept this because of what would happen to us and because of what it would look like. So in summation, as far as the history is concerned, in the beginning, Jews were okay. They were a competing tribe. If you win, you get to humiliate them. But they weren't, there was nothing theologically imperfect or terrible about them. There were some problems, but nothing awful. second-class people. Then they became far more, they must be objects of humiliation. Then, in the 20th century, it became Jews are evil in all aspects and must be wiped out. So, from a rhetorical point of view, I'm not going to say from a, practical point of view, because luckily the state of Israel exists and it can defend its Jews. But from a rhetorical and from a philosophical point of view, Arab anti-Semitism today is the worst it's ever been in history. It's never been this expansive. It's never been covering so many points. And in some ways, I would say it's worse than any anti-Semitism in history, again, from a rhetorical viewpoint. The Nazis had their own problems with Jews that they said, and they had their own philosophy against Jews, and the traditional anti-Semites had their own, and everything like that. The Arabs have included all of those and gone way beyond it, from a, from their, from a philosophical and rhetorical point of view. So, if anti-Semitism is so bad in the Arab world, and it clearly is, how do the NGOs think about this? What does Human Rights Watch and Amnesty? In 2004, they both came out with a statement against anti-Semitism. Wonderful. But, if you look at the specifics, what do they actually say? Very interesting. Not one Muslim attack against Jews in Europe gets mentions what the motive of the attacker was. So I'm just reading from HRW. In January, I wrote this last year. In January, 4 Jewish men were killed, we don't know by who, in a kosher supermarket in Paris, 2 days after the brutal attack on Charlie Hebdo that left 12 people dead. Last week, a man, whoever it was, attacked a synagogue in Copenhagen, killing a Jewish man during a Bat Mitzvah celebration. Last May, a man, whatever, shot 4 people dead in a Jewish museum in Brussels. In 2012, a man and 3 children were shot dead at a Jewish school. Doesn't say who did it. Go a little further in HRW's site. They talk about anti-Semitism sometimes more recently, but they always do it together with Islamophobia in the most recent years. And they imply that the attacks on Jews now are attacks from the right. And they don't want to say that it's from Muslims or from the left. So here's, again, I'm just quoting. The recent increase in anti-Semitic attacks has unfolded in the wake of the Middle East crisis. They follow a general rise in racist, xenophobic violence in Western Europe, particularly against Arabs and certain ethnic and religious minorities. They're not mentioning the Arabs are the ones attacking the Jews. The Arabs are the victims too. So it's despite after, of course, after the September 11th attacks, the worst part of the September 11th attacks, of course, as we all know, was Islamophobia. Nothing to do with 3,000 people dead. It's the Islamophobia is the problem we have to worry about. In the year that began with the shooting of the kosher supermarket, in which some EU leaders now talk openly of not wanting to accept Muslim refugees, put the two together, Jews killed by Muslims, but they're not willing to accept refugees. You can't say who the perpetrators were. It's high time to take seriously hatred against Jews and Muslims in Europe. 2 completely different types of hate. I'm not going to justify the right-wing xenophobic hate against Muslims in Europe, but I'm saying 2 completely different types of hate, and they're putting them together because they do not want anyone to think that their cause, the Palestinian cause, the Muslim cause, the left-wing cause, new left-wing anti-Semitism in Europe, had anything to do with the murders of Jews in Europe. And this is Human Rights Watch. Again, my usual thing of saying, obviously, Jews aren't human. In 2012, I found out, again, reading the Arab media, that there was going to be a new TV series coming out on Ramadan. Every Ramadan, there was, that's when the whole big, very expensive TV series come out, very expensive and expansive TV series come out in the Arab world. Sometimes very historic series. One was called Khaybar. Khaybar was a town that was a Jewish town that got on Muhammad's bad side, and in the end, they were pretty much slaughtered. So they were going to come out with an entire series, really 30-part series about Khaybar. So here's a quote from the series. Ever since they rebelled against Moses, deception has become their creed, conspiracy of their religion until the end of time. This is the stuff that's broadcast in hundreds of millions of Arab TVs on Ramadan in 2012. So I started my own petition to Human Rights Watch and Amnesty saying, you claim you're against anti-Semitism, denounce this TV program before it comes up. We know it's going to happen. We know it's going to be anti-Semitic. There are previous anti-Semitic TV series. There was something called Horsemen Without a Horse that was out in the early 2000s that was based on the Protocols of Elders of Zion. We know it's going to happen. Here it is. You can now step in and do something about it. And you can embarrass them, because that's, again, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, but to go to the punchline first, the way to stop, since Arabs have this honor-shame culture, the way in order to change their behavior is to shame them. You have the opportunity to say something to stop this program from happening ahead of time. Because if Human Rights Watch comes out, or Amnesty comes out with a statement saying, we denounce this program ahead of time, maybe they won't stop it, but they're going to feel a lot more embarrassed and a lot more defensive about it. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty didn't even acknowledge that we gave them an apology. About 6,000 signatures we got. But they didn't even acknowledge the petitions. And they ignored direct Arab incitement to murder Jews. In other conflicts, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty will condemn incitement to violence. They said they're very big on free speech. Of course they're big on free speech. But incitement to violence crosses the line. We can't have that. And they'll talk about any other conflict, whether it's Kosovo or this and that. They'll say, incitement is really out of bounds. But here's the incitement we see daily, not just Hamas, but Fatah, the ruling party of the Palestinian Authority, on their Facebook page. It shows, hey, we will begin with stones and end up with a state. It shows their progression. Hey, stones to knives to Molotov cocktails to guns to hand grenades to submachine guns to RPGs. And this is what they're saying. This poster is an incitement to violence on the official Fatah Facebook page. And the message is very clear to everybody, and this is just one of many, many that come up. They come up every couple of weeks. You'll have something like this that come up. Certainly during the height of the, last September, October, and November, during all the knifings and the stabbings and the car rammings, they were filled with cartoons that were supporting this, filled with it. And this is the official Fatah. Mahmoud Abbas is the leader of Fatah. It's his party. He could tell them to cut it out immediately, and they would. Effectively, the NGO obsession with Israel is anti-Semitic itself. There are far more reports against Israel, written by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, against any other nation over the years, certainly. Their standards of conduct for other countries, especially Arab countries, are far lower. They hold the Jews to a much higher standard, which is anti-Semitic, because when you hold Jews to an impossibly high standard, beyond even what they expect from other Western nations, because every single civilian that's killed by an Israelis is worth mentioning by name as a big deal. Yeah, thousands of people killed by drones in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's they'll mention it. They'll say here and there. But they do not go into as much detail. They don't get the human side of the story in their reports. They don't have as many reports about these things as they do. But it's also racist because they're not expecting Arabs to have any standards altogether. They're expecting Arabs to act less human than Jews do. This is racism. And nobody really talks about it from that perspective. But when you don't expect Arabs and Muslims to be able to act the same way as Jews do, then you're sort of saying that, okay, then you don't have to. And it's giving them a free pass to act in less than moral ways. The media also all but ignores Arab anti-Semitism. There are a couple of exceptions. The Poison Well story, the only reason that the media took a note of it, because there's, as I said, there have been dozens of things that Abbas has said that are crazy over the years. The only reason they took note of it is because Israel made a stink over it. When Netanyahu goes out and condemns it, they can't ignore the story. So then they go, okay, fine, now we're going to ask Abbas what his opinion is. And that's when he was reporting. But that's only because Israel did. If Israel wouldn't have done that, the reporters would not have done anything about this. There was a Morsi. And again, this is the exception that proves the rule. Morsi in 2012 was found to have said in 2010 about the Jews, these bloodsuckers who attack the Palestinians, warmongers, descendants of apes and pigs, founding the things of civil strife over there. This is standard Muslim Brotherhood rhetoric, and this standard Islamist rhetoric against Jews. It happens all the time. Morsi happened to become president of Egypt, so Memory was smart enough to dig up the old statements, which they have an encyclopedia of statements like this, and include it to the news. So sometimes you get something that's too delicious for the news to ignore, which is the same sort of thing which happened to me with Mifta with the blood libel, because Hanan Ashrawi, blood libel, okay. And that sometimes you can get in, you'll get the news media to be slightly interested in this. But in general, they're not. The non-exceptions of what happens on Palestinian TV all the time. And if you just look at Palestinian media, watch again, encyclopedia worth of examples. And here's just one, strike the Jews, count them down, and kill them to the last one. On their TV. It's what's happening. This is today. And it doesn't get, okay, the Jerusalem Post might mention it, the Times of Israel will say something about it, AP New York Times is not going to bother. So why do they all ignore Arab anti-Semitism? In general, the Palestinian cause is considered to be a liberal leftist national liberation movement against colonialism, the Jews, of course, being the colonialists. And these people believe it, and they say, so therefore they're going to give them a pass. They're really on their side. Okay, they do some things that are not quite so good, but, they're liberal, they're leftist, they're resisting colonialism. Also, Westerners really want to believe, and a lot of reporters are like this, they're good people, they really want to believe that there's a solution, to this problem. So that, they've grown up on it, they said, really, we've got to find a solution. And if they expose the hate, and if they expose what's happening, again, I'm not talking about Hamas, I'm talking about the mainstream, Mahmoud Abbas and his people, if he's found to be an anti-Semite, then there's no hope, because every other potential leader of the Palestinians is worse than he is. At least he officially denounces violence. The other ones, pretty much all, are for it. So, therefore, they don't want to even mention the story, because they don't want to kill that hope of a peace process, even though there is no hope for peace. Because they don't even want to accept that, because Westerners want to find solutions. Westerners don't like accepting that there might be an intractable problem that's going to last for centuries. They can't. We need to solve things. That's the way we think. We're solution-oriented. There must be a solution. Abbas is the closest thing to a solution we have. We have to keep pushing to make things happen, to make people think from that perspective. We'll ignore the fact that he's also a Holocaust denier, and that's what he wrote his thesis on. Okay, forget it. And also some reporters are latent anti-Semites, anti-Zionists themselves, where they want to blame the occupation. I just threw this in. Here's something from 100 years before occupation, literally 100 years, 1867. Sir Moses Montefiore said, "The land of Jaffa has been unfortunately let to persons who, being unable to resist the threatened attacks of neighboring Arabs, deserted the place altogether. The first refugees were Jews from 1867 in Jaffa. The consequence is that the houses are completely demolished and the trees destroyed." So they were essentially scared and forced out by fear from what the Arabs were doing to them 100 years before occupation. But the occupation is, I once drew a little cartoon called Occupation Glasses, in which all these peoples, they look at everything through, you must look at everything through the lens of occupation. If there's a cute kid on TV singing or on YouTube singing a song, that might be cute. But if you find out that he lives on the other side of the green line, oh no, that's terrible. You're only doing that in order to stay, in order to deny the occupation or something, whatever. That's the way they think. What can be done? And I mentioned this briefly, but it's very important. Shame, since it's an honor-shame society, shame is a weapon that we need to use. And it's something that reporters and NGOs have this weapon and they refuse to use it. Because they're afraid of, backlash from the Arabs. Saying, well, you can't shame us, you can't, they're worried about that. They have the weapon. And it works. It has worked in minor ways, but it's worked. The anti-Semitism we're seeing right now in the media is really pretty much a resurgence. There was, for a number of years, the Arab media's overt anti-Semitism was muted because they didn't want to be looked at as less moral than the West was. And when the Westerners cared about overt anti-Semitism, they started backing off. Memory, they were there. Sometimes they'll talk about memory and say, they're nervous when they see things like this happen. But they don't want to look less moral than others. Since there has been no pushback, I believe, it's been resurging. There's been more and more anti-Semitism because there's no consequence. Nobody in the world cares about this anti-Semitism. They're expecting it, and if the Arabs are expected to do this behavior, of course they're going to continue to do this behavior. So shaming is really the thing that must be done. The press needs to do it, politicians need to do it, and the NGOs need to do it. And if they aren't doing it, then we have to shame them into doing it. Because this is crazy. They have to start treating the Arabs the way they treat everybody else. But certainly, at least the same standards that they treat the Jews. Or they should start treating the Jews, whatever. They should be consistent in how they do things. Similarly, like the NGO lies that have been out there, I and others have been debunking their lies for years, but Israel can step up too, and they do more. We saw what happened. Israel just mentioned, hey, we're upset over Abbas's, poisoning the wells libel. If Israel would come and say, here's Amnesty's report, here are all the things that are inaccurate about it. Correct it, or we're not going to cooperate with you on it, or something like that. Just, make a big deal over it. Because why give them the halo effect? Why allow them to have the halo effect of being, this wonderful, prestigious, human rights organization, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, as well as Oxfam and all the other ones that are out there, if they're telling not the truth, and there's very often they do not tell the truth. My blog today goes through examples from last year from Amnesty International about the Gaza war, things they said that were completely not true. They were saying, here's a house that was bombed by Israel, there are only civilians here. Here's a house that was killed, only civilians killed. Every single time they tweeted that, within 15 minutes I said, here's the name of the militant they were aiming at. Here it is. I was able to find out who it was based on a lot of sources that are out there. And nothing, because they ignored me. People even wrote to Amnesty and said, hey, I'm reading this stuff in Elder Zion. Can you debunk it? And they finally, one of them answered and said, we don't believe he's credible. That was it. You know, like, and pictures, you know, they said, here's a 13-year-old kid who was killed. I'm showing you a picture of this 19-year-old guy who has that name with a machine gun, you know, going back and forth. And they're saying, no, that's, you know, they don't want to talk about that soon. They still believe it's a 13-year-old kid. Crazy, crazy stuff. The Israeli government has the ability because the press doesn't ignore what they say. But that's pretty much it. I mean, I wish I could say better ideas of this, but I believe shame is really the only thing that could possibly do it, because they believe that they're immoral people. And, you know, fundamentally, Muslims believe that they're more moral than everybody else. If you are saying you're less moral and you're proving it, they get embarrassed. In fact, I'll even just one other short example. It's a very funny example. During, maybe it was the second Gaza War, I'm trying to remember, or even between the two. Of all places, the Zawahiri from Al-Qaeda, I'm pretty sure it was Zawahiri, denounced Hamas for aiming rockets at civilians. It was really the most bizarre thing. He said, you know, hey, we are only really doing army, so you should only be aiming at the army, you should not be aiming at civilians. That's against the Quran. And Hamas was put on the defensive. And Hamas was saying, no, we really are only aiming at civilians. Don't, we're not really aiming at civilians. Even the posters that say kill, it's just like, but they were like, and the next war, I believe it was in 2012, I'm trying to remember. The next war, Hamas's press releases for every single one of their rockets, because they will document every rocket and say, we shot this one, we shot that one. The previous war, 2009, they would say, oh, we shot towards Sderot, we shot towards Ashdod. This time they say, we shot towards Israeli army positions in Sderot, and Israeli army positions out there. It was just their press release changed to that because they were shamed by, of all places, Al-Qaeda. So there is, it's bizarre, but nevertheless, shame is really the thing that works. We see it happen with Abbas. We see that is the weapon. And it could be used, and it could be weaponized by us. And that's what we need to do. And we need to be able to get our people, you know, get the supposedly moral NGOs to be able to say, if you really want to be moral and do the right thing, you don't treat them with kid gloves. You treat them as adults. And you treat them as if they have to take responsibility for their actions. They will. And this happens with kids too. If you treat, however you treat the kid is how the kid ends up acting. And it's the same sort of thing with people, you know, with massive people. If you treat them as if they have to take responsibility for their actions, they have to start doing it because they do not want to look like they're immature and that they're immoral. That's pretty much it. Any questions?